Do some grounding. Okay, we're going live in here, and I'm just going to pop into Instagram. All right, we are good.
Nice.
Got some nice green ticks in places.
You let me know.
This is always the nerve-wracking bit, isn't it? The technology. As we go live at 7, let's just hope that all the gods are with us.
How do we know when people are here?
We start to see people logging in, so yeah, we can see them.
Oh, it's live on YouTube.
It's coming
Katrina
in.
says.
Right, we'll just give people a few minutes to log in and join us.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so people are joining.
Great.
Just give people a couple of minutes to get in with us.
Come on in, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Roll up, roll up. Here to talk about worms. Who's excited?
Yeah,
I am.
Right, Miri, I think we can make a start. Do you think?
Yes, absolutely. I can't see how many people are here, so I'm just going to...
I think that's a good thing, isn't it?
I think that's a good thing. Welcome, everybody, to our Horse First Autumn Worm Control webinar. So I am Miri Hackett. If you may know me through my social media, if you don't, then I am a very horse first horse trainer, and I have a real passion for parasite control. Both of my parents are scientists, and actually my mum is a parasitologist, which means she's a parasite scientist. And so I grew up around this kind of thing, and when the opportunity to work with Westgate came along, I thought, you know what, yeah, I'm really aligned with this. I've been using Westgate to do our worm egg counting for many years, and so here I am now hosting a webinar with the very cool Claire Shand and Jacqui Matthews, who is from Equisal. So if ever you've stuck one of those funny little cotton buds in your horse's mouth, Jacqui is the lady who created the testing and helps us with the tapeworm side of things. But Jacqui, do you want to introduce yourself in a maybe slightly more eloquent way than that?
Yeah, absolutely, Mary, no problem. So I'm Professor Jacqui Matthews. I'm the Director of Veterinary Science at Austin Davis Biologics, and also an honorary professor at the University of Edinburgh's Royal Dutch School of Veterinary Studies. I've been passionate about worms since my 3rd year of lectures in parasitology, which was way back in 1987, I think, well before most of the people on this call were probably born. And since then, I have worked on veterinary worms in cattle, sheep and horses, initially in academia and in the last few years at Austin Davis Biologics. I worked at Glasgow, Liverpool and Edinburgh vet schools and taught students there, and we ran a research programme looking at vaccines for sheep and cattle worms. But with respect to tonight, we did a lot of work on horse parasites, how they were spread, how to diagnose them, just their basic biology, try and understand these critters so that we could address them, because as you'll learn tonight, and I'm sure you already know, they've been very adept at developing resistance to wormers over the last 40 or so years. And as part of that work, I was an inventor of the small red worm test, which is a test you may or may not have heard about. We'll talk about it later on, which can be used to help understand the level of infection of small red worms in horses. I'm not actually an inventor of the tapeworm test. I'll pass that on to my... That's all right, really. That original work for that was done at Liverpool just before I worked there, and we set up a diagnostic company and we marketed the blood test. But Austin Davis, about 12 years ago, a bit longer, were very, very clever, and they took that technology from the blood to the saliva platform, which is the foundation of Equisal, which is a tapeworm test, which I'm sure many of the people on the call will have used tonight. And since my time at Austin Davis, I've been there after they translated and commercialised a small red worm test. I have been there since 2022 and do a couple of things, a lot of knowledge transfer like this, CPD for vets and SQPs, developing new tests and developing programs of other tests that we need for horses, parasites and disease. And I sit on a number of committees and bodies that are to do with translating and developing guidelines for parasite control. One of those, which you may be aware of in the equine side, is Canter. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here before. I've never streamed before, so this is a first for me. Hopefully not a last time. And I'll pass back to you. So thanks for having me tonight.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm definitely going to leave the facts to you guys because, as you can tell, I'm here to help guide things, but not to give out the information. So, Claire, do you want to introduce yourself in case other people don't know what you do?
Yeah, sure. So we are Westgate Laboratories. It was my mum and dad that set the company up 26 years ago now, and it was our ponies when I was a teenager that we first started testing and really revolutionized. You know, my dad was a leader in his field at setting up worm egg counts with a postal system so that horse owners could get them directly. They could be easy to do, easy to understand, and really then to get people to do testing, evidence-based control. So that's really what we've been known for all these years. And as a marketing director, it's really my job, my role, I see, to look at the science and all of the papers and the best practice that's coming out. And I'm like the glue, the interface to make that into bite-size and easy to understand protocols that horse owners can follow, and just to help knowledge share and really change these behaviors and get them out so that we can all use them. You know, we're all horse owners here, and sometimes there is best practice science and there is practicalities, and it's really like, well, how do you distill that into something that you can do? Because that's it, making change is like the big piece here. So yeah, really excited to be here tonight and to help people with their autumn worm control.
Wonderful. Before we get into our kind of main topic of conversation, just a little bit of housekeeping for you all. So you may be watching this live. If you are, welcome. We have a comment section where you can ask questions as we go along. That should be on, you can like comment just directly on the Facebook Live, and you should be able to ask us some questions and we will answer them potentially as we go along if they're relevant, but we will have a Q&A section towards the end of the webinar. We also, I will mention at this point that we are going to be having a competition this evening. So we've got 3 prizes. We've got 1 main prize and then 2 runner-up prizes. And we are going to, you could win over £200 of test kits and goodies. And that is, you know, a good amount. It's a year's supply essentially for one horse. So if you would like to be in with a chance of winning, then you need to comment on that live on Facebook to kind of show us that you're here. So if you can go ahead and do that, you can do that any point through the webinar. We will be giving you reminders if you join us later, don't worry. And yeah, it's exciting. We like a giveaway, don't we? So in this webinar, we are going to be talking about why a risk-based approach matters for every horse. We're going to cover practical testing and treatment strategies. And I've got some questions that we're going to be working through and talking about, and some of my like kind of real life things that I have gone with. But if you want to kick us off, Claire, and get us started with sort of, you know, why is this risk-based approach so important?
Yeah, it's really what we've been talking about all year, and it just gives me an opportunity to trot out one of my absolute favourite graphics, which we've had for our Every Horse, Every Size, Every Season campaign this year, which is to do with the fact that every horse needs good parasite control. You know, it's something that affects every single horse. And for us, it starts with a worm egg count as the cornerstone of that for parasite control. And then we move on from that to this autumn really talking about a horse-first approach to parasite control, which is that every horse's parasite risk is different. So what we'd all really love is just a timetable, a framework, do this then, and this then, but it isn't as simple as that. So we're going to go on and talk about all the different factors that influence that. And we can use this Cantor framework. So Jacqui and I have both been involved in developing this as an acronym, just to explain like all of the different factors that influence that. So we start with the C, clinical history. So anything the horse has got as an underlying issue, like from that impacts the immune system, from like a PPID, Cushing's, EMS, anything that's going to put stress on the immune system is going to impact the horse's ability to withstand a parasite infection as well. We've got age profiles, so we know that the young and the old are compromised either from underactive immune systems or as that declines with age. Number of horses is really important. So the more horses that we've got in a group, the more important parasite infection becomes and the more transmissible that is. We know from our test results that just some horses are more susceptible. They are higher egg shedders. They give higher results, and we have to keep a closer eye on them. And then also the environment is really important. So is it poo picked? Is the field well managed? All of these have a really big impact then on the horse's risk profile, and we can decide, are they low, medium, high? And then we can look at how do we build a program that's going to support that horse from a perspective of targeting treatments only where necessary, so that we can go forward and keep them healthy.
And there's a very interesting statistic, isn't there? This 80-20 stat that you've put on the screen now. Jacqui, do you want to tell us a little bit about this and some of the kind of the data that we've got to back this up?
Sure, thanks, Miri. Yeah, so what we find is when you look particularly at an adult horse population is that the worms are not evenly distributed between all the individual horses within that group. And what we find is there's usually a smaller group of horses which tend to have higher worm burdens, and therefore that we can measure through higher egg shedding. And that's what we call the 80-20 rule. And that's what we find in well-managed horses, that actually 80% of the burden is just in that fifth of the horses generally within that population. Now, the reason why this is so is probably to do with the immune response to the parasite in individuals. And that immune response is both controlled by the genetic makeup of that horse that defines what sort of immunity it would express against the worms. Also, perhaps the behaviour of the horse, whether it is a horse that perhaps grazes near where poo is deposited on paddocks and isn't so discriminatory. So whatever happens and whatever's controlling that, we find that some horses just maintain the susceptibility to worms throughout life. The good side of that is that when we're concerned about overusing wormers, we can actually use that distribution to pinpoint individual animals that we should treat. And that allows us to also identify by testing those horses that don't require treatment at a given time. So for example, in this slide here, there's a group of horses showing that typical 80-20 rule. The fancy name is a negative binomial distribution, if anyone wants any extra points for learning tonight. And what we see in this negative binomial distribution is a typical pattern of like a quarter to a fifth of those horses having a high egg shedding pattern, and then the remainder of the group having a low egg shedding pattern. So that means what we can do is we can take the fecal samples, dung samples from those horses, and we can count the eggs per gram in each of those horses' dung sample. And that enables us to identify which of those animals is excreting the most eggs, and therefore we can apply treatment. Now, for animals below a certain threshold, and the common one that we use, and you probably other people that use other egg counts or vets to do their egg counts, they probably use the same one of 200 eggs per gram. And what we say is you should leave the horses untreated that are under 200 eggs per gram. And that has the effect if the parasites get onto the pasture from the horses after treatment, any worms that survive in the treated horse, the eggs that are derived from those worms that survive, they go onto the pasture, but then they're diluted by the worms from the horses that haven't been treated. So we have this mixing of different genotypes, either worms that have been selected by treatment, but worms that are from horses that haven't been treated. And that means that the next round of infection in those horses on that field, when those worms mate, what we find is that hopefully the genes that are mediating or resistance, that have survived in the horses, that in the treated horses, in that next round of infection, those genes will be diluted and mixed with the genes from the worms of the horses that haven't been treated. So that's a really important concept to understand, is this 80-20 rule.
I think also very important to note at this moment that, and I only learned this not that long ago, is that all horses have some level of worms. Is that an accurate thing to say? Could you just maybe go into that a little bit, somebody?
Yeah, I can talk about that. So it's particularly, I mean, obviously horses have different types of worms that they're infected with. And generally what we're talking about here are small red worms. These are really, really common worms. Other species of worms that they get are not so common, or maybe have slightly different distributions. But with the small red worms, what we find is we go into populations, and it could be here in the UK, it could be Australia, it could be South America, it could be parts of Europe, probably China as well. You go in and you look at the level of infection, the percentage of horses that are infected, which is called the prevalence. If you go in and look at the prevalence of small red worms, you find in grazing horses it's generally 95% plus. So what we can say is at some stage in their life, all horses that graze will be infected by small red worm. And actually at any point in time is most horses will be infected with small red worm, unless they've received some very effective treatment or something recently like that. But generally they will all be infected. But thankfully for horses, they develop an immunity, and then we start to see this negative binomial distribution come in. So when they're younger, they tend to have higher burdens, because they don't have an effective immune response to the worm, and you generally see higher burdens and higher egg counts in young horses right up to 3-4 years old. And then as they get older and they adapt to the presence of the parasite and they generate an immune response, we tend to see this negative binomial. So we usually, again, just typically, you take a group of horses and all are likely to be infected, but very small number with large numbers of worms. And we see that pattern time and time again, regardless of the type of grazing that horses are on, or the part of the world. What we see though, and it's important to understand this, in places of very high contamination, if you can imagine lots of horses piled onto a paddock and no dung removal, particularly if there's some youngsters there, this distribution falls apart. And what we tend to see are higher levels of egg counts in more horses. And of course, that's a bit of a vicious circle, because the higher number of egg counts in more horses will lead to more contamination, and the cycle will continue. So this negative binomial 80-20 rule tends to be unreasonably or well-managed groups of horses, but it can fall apart if management is poor.
Speaking of environment and difficulty of that, we have just had a very, very hot summer in the UK, and I know that my fields looked very different from how they have looked in previous years. Now, I believe that you guys have some data on this, where we are looking at number of worm egg counts and percentage of horses that would need a wormer. Can you, or had a worm egg count over 200 eggs per gram? Claire, this is really super interesting data, and obviously we haven't quite finished our year yet, but could you talk us through a bit what we are seeing with the change in the climate that we've had this year in terms of the graph? Yeah,
sure. So this is the results of horses over 200 eggs per gram of the cohort of horses that we've tested here at Westgate over the last 3 years, or almost 3 years. So you can see there the 2023, 2024 in blue, and then the 2025 results in the pink. And you can see how generally they follow a similar pattern, but we were having a hunch that we were having more horses needing treatment this summer and into the autumn than we've seen in previous years. And you can see how the data there reflects that very much so. And we would have a hunch that that's an environmental impact. You know, you mentioned the summer that we've had, and Jacqui was very much talking about the life cycle, the transmission, that sort of thing. And yeah, Jacqui, if you'd like to give us your take on it, we'd be really fascinated to hear why we think that this is really seeing a lot higher numbers of horses needing to be treated than we would have previously in other autumns.
Thanks, Claire. And actually, I was very intrigued by this, because we don't really get the chance to see this. There's thousands of horses in this data set, to sort of see this level of data of trends of egg counts over time in different years. So it's a fantastic data set. And I have to admit, I was a little surprised because I thought it would either stay the same or we might have had an effect of a larval kill with the dry, hot summer we've had generally in the United Kingdom this year. But I think what this graph is telling us is, first of all, these horses have got higher levels of infection. There's more horses with that higher level of infection. So that would indicate, working backwards, that transmission is increased. So we then wonder, why would transmission be increased? Well, we know, and data that we've generated in the past and people in other labs and in other countries, we do know that, as you're probably aware, the eggs are released in dung into the environment. This is, again, small red worms, strongyles. And these eggs hatch to release a first stage larva, which undergoes a molt to a second stage larva, which then undergoes a molt to a third stage larva. And that all happens in the poo pat. And that development from the egg to the third stage larva is affected by three main things: temperature and humidity, and also translation of the L3 out of the pat, the movement out of the pat by rainfall. So what we, I think, is probably happening here is, because of the high temperature, average temperature that's been present throughout the UK throughout the summer, it's caused those eggs to develop much quicker through to the third stage infective larvae than in cooler years. And then we've had these periods where there's been maybe rain now and again, there's maybe been a thunderstorm, or even within the environment, the microenvironment of the paddock, it's still quite moist. So what we're finding is the eggs are developing quickly through to the L3, and the L3 are moving out. The horses are coming along and they're munching that grass and they're picking up these L3, and their burdens are increasing. Now, there's two things that we can, I guess, develop from that, about the facts that we've just talked about. First of all, is the frequency of dung removal. So we know that eggs can develop to L3 under optimal conditions of about 25 degrees, which, I mean, in Edinburgh, where I'm based, we think, oh, it's hardly ever that, but we have had that sort of temperature quite a lot this summer. So eggs can develop to L3s within a week. So that's why we say that people should lift poo, should poo pick at least weekly, in order to lift that dung up before that L3 can develop and escape the fecal pile. So that's why we say you should dung remove at least once a week. The other thing that has been very traditional in the horse world for many, many decades is to harrow, is to spread the dung across the paddock, with the idea of, from a parasitological point of view, that the worms are spread across the paddock and then they're exposed to sunlight and they dry out and they die due to desiccation. Now, that might work in very hot, dry, arid areas, but even, I think, in this type of summer that we've had, although it's been hot and generally dry, I don't think harrowing is effective enough to kill these third stage larvae, which actually they keep on the little coat of the second stage larvae as a protective sheath. They're really quite resistant to drying out and desiccation. So I think what we're seeing here is the impact of a warm summer allowing that larval development phase to speed up and horses to become infected with more larvae. And what we need to consider then, particularly in warm conditions, and when there's occasional rainfall, is we really have to get on top of that poo picking, that regular poo picking. And actually, it doesn't look like, even if people were harrowing this year, it was going to have an effect, because I don't think the conditions are dry and hot enough for the worms to die.
So we're seeing this rise in horses needing treatment, and I have seen this myself on my yard. I have just done our autumn worm egg count and our equicell tests, and we have a higher number than we did have last year at this time of year. But before we just reach for our wormer and we all go, oh goodness, that means we've all got a blanket wormer, Claire, can you talk us through a little bit about kind of what we should be doing in this setting?
Yeah, it is really tempting, isn't it, to think, oh my goodness, the worm burdens are going up, we need to step in, we need to give a treatment. But we've got this thing called resistance that I'm sure everybody will have heard of. And it's really putting us in a tricky situation, because the wormers just aren't working as well anymore, particularly against these small red worm, which are just so numerous. So it's really about identifying which horses do we need to target and preserving those wormers with efficacy as long as possible. And we know that most adult horses can deal very well with low burdens. And And actually there's quite a lot of information coming through from human medicine that a small burden is a good thing in terms of like autoimmune disease and things like that. So we're not wanting to rush in and kill off every worm. That is the practice that drives resistance. It's so important that we help preserve our wormers with keeping them effective, because if we get to the position where we have multi-resistant parasite strains, and it means we have untreatable parasite burdens, and that means disease and death and untold consequence for yard owners, for horse owners. We just don't want to have to contemplate that. So at the moment, if we act now, if we start really to put this into practice, we've got a chance to keep a hold of this, to buy ourselves time, hopefully before we get some more answers, because we've only got 5 chemicals and there's no new ones in development. So this is why this is critically important for our ability to keep our horses safe.
Thank you, Claire. That's really helpful to understand, and you know, to really kind of lay it out very black and white that that's where we're at. So one of the things that we're going to talk about this evening is our ability to risk assess our horses. Now, we had some polls running in the lead up to our webinar. The first was to ask about risk assessment, essentially. So good to see. It was great that 75% of you have completed the What's Your Worm Risk online calculator, and it's interesting to see the breakdown of the results and some of the comments. Jacqui, What's Your Worm Risk is a tool that you developed. Are these typical results that you expect to see that we've got on the screen now?
Well, actually, I'm not going to lie. Actually, these are really good results. I think this is a cohort of Westgate people that are completing the What's Your Worm Risk tool, because actually I think these people are already being converted to best practice methods of worm control, because we're seeing very high levels of low risk. Now, low risk in the worm risk tool, which we developed at Austin Davis together with Tim Mayer from Bell Equine Clinic, it takes in several factors that affect a horse's risk of worm infection. So age is a really important one, as Claire pointed out earlier. We also included things like stocking density and the egg counts of the horse itself and the horses that it co-grazes with, the tapeworm equisal counts. And small red worm serum scores as well. People had done that test as well. So it takes all these answers to these questions that ask people about their own horse, and it puts it into an algorithm, and it spits out this risk, either low, moderate or high. And obviously, I think the people that have been completing this little survey that was done specifically for this webinar are actually already a large proportion of them must be having very good parasite control, because the algorithm is indicating that they're following guidelines for management and their test results are low. However, we do see these people in the medium, and we see people in the high risk categories. And actually, I looked at, so we launched this last year, about a year ago just now actually, and the last time I looked at it in the summer, there's over 2,000 people had completed the What's Your Worm Risk tool, and actually these values were flipped. And actually about over 60% of people were in the high risk category. And when I went in, I've looked at the data about what people are doing that are causing this high score. The general trends showed me that people were stalking horses at high density. Now, obviously, that can't always be a thing that you control. You've got a certain number of horses on a certain bit of land, so that will push your risk up. But all the more reason then to increase the other things, the other pieces of best practice that you can do to reduce worm transmission. And one of those, of course, would be dung removal. So if you have a high stalking density, then your frequency of dung removal should be higher than if you have a very, very, very low stocking density, and then your frequency of dung removal is lower. Or I mean, if it's one horse in 50 acres, obviously you don't have to do any dung removal at all. So I think that balance is really shown up here compared to our normal data set. The other thing that we found, again, frequency of dung removal in the big data set from What's Your Worm Risk. And the other thing is people didn't seem to be using equisal testing for tapeworm. And if they're not testing, you can't look at a horse and say it's got a lot of tapeworm from the outside, and egg counts aren't good for tapeworm because of the intermittent egg shedding behaviour of the worms of tapeworm. And the problem with tapeworm is you only require about 20 or more worms to cause really quite bad damage in the intestinal wall, and that could be a risk factor for colic. So that was one of the things we found. I think this probably reflects that quite a lot of people are on the programme of the Westgate, where they actually use Equisal testing, and with good management they'll have low results in that.
We can go on and look at that now, Jacqui, actually, because we've got some results back again from the poll. So I'll just click that through. Really? This is our how often do people worm egg count? And this is a really brilliant result here to see so many people doing a worm egg count every 8 to 12 weeks. And it's the life cycle of the small red worm. Every 4 to 5 weeks, it can renew itself to become an egg-laying adult. And I think that just means that it's so important that we do our testing, because it means that anything that perfect storm that helps those to multiply, we can get it before it gets out of hand. So that's why that's really important. And there was a couple of other comments that said that those testing twice yearly or yearly had very low risk horses, had done their risk assessments, were seeing good results, and had widened that out. And for those people, we would just say, just keep an eye out on your risk and then go from there. And if anything changes, just pop another test in and make sure that you're up and on that one. And we can also see some similar results with our tapeworm testing as well, Jacqui, which will please and I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great to see that uptake of tapeworm testing. I mean, obviously, the test was designed to help people test for tapeworm rather than have to call out a vet and get a blood sample taken. So that's a big money saving for that type of test. Obviously, I think people maybe feel, well, practicalities of the test, is it challenging? And one of the things we get a bit of feedback is this this need for this half hour for the horse not to eat or drink before we test. And we asked people to do that because if you can imagine, like yourself or your horse, if you're eating something, you produce a lot more saliva. And obviously we're measuring antibody in saliva, and if there's more saliva there, the antibody becomes more dilute, and then it gets too low for us to measure in the test we use in the lab. So if people are struggling, what we tend to say to them is, actually, if you're just bringing your horse in, give it a really special groom and you're doing stuff with its feet, just tie it up, just take that little Equisal test after you're finished. That can easily take half an hour. Or if it's a youngster in hand and you don't want to bring them in and tie them up, you can take them a little walk, just give them a little training, walking with their head collar on, and 15 minutes out and 15 minutes back, and therefore you can take your sample. So there shouldn't really be any practical hurdles for people to follow the guidelines that we set for the test. And I would just hope more people test, because we now have tapeworm wormer resistance. It was reported in the States a year and a half ago. And we've definitely got anecdotal evidence in the UK that it's a problem here on some farms, stud farms in the UK and in France. So what we really want people to do is to test for tapeworm, because it can cause a problem. But in most situations, what we find, over 66% of horses are negative in the test and they don't require a wormer.
And that's, I think, a really interesting thing to note is that although it may be that it's slightly more complicated, it's as in, there's a little more effort required with the tapeworm test, that the effort is worth it for the reward that you're going to gain from understanding about what your horse really truly needs, because tapeworm can be really damaging, as can other worms in high burdens. But can we talk a little bit about kind of best practice in terms of a program? Now, this is something that I had to really get my head around. I have a very mixed group of horses. So I have some horses that live with us all the time. I have some younger ones, some older ones, and a fairly consistent group. But then I also have horses that come and go from the yard on a shorter term basis. So finding a program for us was really important, because I needed to have a structure to follow. Claire, can you talk to us a little bit about that structure and kind of why that is so important? We've sort of touched on it, but could you go into a bit more detail?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we say that it's one worm egg count is a snapshot, but it's really a series across the season that start to tell the story. So it's really building up a picture of what's going on inside the horse as a barometer of health, that we do our worm egg counts so regularly, and we put our tapeworm testing in as well. So we're looking at that strategically, and then we're also looking particularly now in autumn, at our approach then to the potential for insisted stages of small redworm as well through late autumn, winter. So there's all of those things that are going on and into the mix, really. And it's about really the importance. I think what's so good is that you're prioritizing parasite control as a yard owner, because it is often a silent problem until it's not. You know, you get something like a larval cyatostominosis colic, or you get large redworm, which is another parasite that's kind of raising its head at the moment, and suddenly you've got an untreatable parasite burden, you've got multi-resistant worms. It's not a way as a yard owner to keep clients happy or their horses healthy, and it's a massive headache for all concerned, you know, which is really what we don't want. So it's very, very important that we do that. And really then it's about making sure that when we've got horses coming in, we are quarantining them, and we're making sure that we're doing our testing and our treating. And I think Jacqui was going to talk then about that risk assessment approach and the treating testing kind of dynamic in terms of when you're going to risk assess and at what level you're going to approach at both. Is that right, Jacqui?
Sure, I can see that. I mean, just obviously time's passing on, but you know, I think it's very challenging for people like ourselves trying to push and promote best practice, because it was so easy for people in the past just to say, well, I'll just worm every 6 to 8 weeks, and who could forget the Pramox and the Quest pack, where you could use every 13 weeks, and then people had to just use these four treatments a year, and that was it. The worms would be eradicated. But sadly, as we've mentioned earlier, that is not the case. And the thing is, what you don't want is drug resistance at high levels within a population of worms, because when those susceptible animals, those young animals, or those immune compromised animals pick up a big burden and they get sick, the wormers don't work, and that is a big cost. Not to mention even a horse getting sick due to worms because you're not controlling it, because you don't understand how the parasite life cycle works, and maybe you haven't tested your drug effectiveness and the drugs don't work. Then to have a clinical case go into hospitals is extortionate. I was watching a webinar the other day from Ireland, and they talked about 3 thoroughbreds that had gone into hospital with larval cyatostominosis, which is small redworm disease, and it was about 10 to 12,000 euros cost to just treat those horses. And that wasn't surgical, that was just the medical cost. So we need to try and avoid that and try and take this approach, and our job is really to try and simplify it, so that people can follow it, but there's still some evidence basis there that's driving the decisions. So the first thing you always have to do is a risk assessment, and you can use what's your worm risk, or you can look at canter guidelines, which are online, and you can put in your horse's profile. So if your horse comes out as a low risk, that's good, because probably that will mean you'll do your egg counts and the egg counts will be low, and it doesn't really require any treatments. And as you go into the autumn, and we're talking about strongyles here, your options are going into late autumn and winter is either you have to consider the stages that you can't detect with an egg count, and these are the insisted larval stages. And these can accumulate within the gut wall, particularly in young horses, to the order of millions of worms. Now, in well-managed low-risk horses, they rarely have thousands of worms, because they can control the infection, and they're on clean paddocks, or they're standing in a box because they're a dressage horse, or they're a horse in training. So these low risk horses, you can make the decision actually when you get to the autumn, their egg counts might be low, but they might have some level of larval burden. But if you do a low risk, you can consider, well, we don't have to treat them. However, if you are that's kind of doing nothing, is leaving a bit of a gap. So what we did is we developed the small redworm blood test, which basically it's a test that measures antibodies to all of the stages of the worms that are in your horse of small redworm. And we measure those antibodies in blood. A sample can be taken by your vet, and then we report back a serum score, just similar that you get a saliva score to with Equisal. And then what we will tell you is if your horse has a burden of 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000, if it has a burden below that, one of these thresholds, speak to your vet, and they can decide at what threshold you don't have to treat your horse. So that just gives you, I guess, peace of mind that your horse does have a low burden, and treatment can be withheld. Now, in the other situation, with a high-risk horse, for example, young horse or a horse on a paddock where dung's not removed with high stocking density, its egg counts are likely to be higher over the summer. So you probably have to do more frequent egg counts. But you get to this time of year where you think there could be a large, small redworm burden there. And actually, then you have to think, well, what am I going to do? So we would recommend the small red worm blood test in that example, because it tends to work at these lower threshold burdens to tell people about if your horse is a low burden that doesn't need treatment. So what we would recommend going into late autumn and winter is to consider a small red worm encysted larval anthelmintic treatment for those horses that are high risk. And because of the high resistance we get to benzimidazoles, we'd recommend that you would use moxidectin. So that's how risk can affect what you do. But just do risk, test, good management, and apply treatments either strategically if it's a high risk or if indicated by your test results.
Thanks, Jacqui. I think it would be really useful. We've got some comments coming through on the Facebook, and there's a lot of questions around poo picking, and we have some interesting data on poo picking. There were some pictures of my horses. That was nice for a moment. Maybe we'll come back to talking about my own horses, because I've had some interesting things going with my own. But one of the best things that we can do to break the life cycle of the worms without relying on chemicals is poo picking, isn't it? You can all get gold stars. Look at the results of our poo picking poll. 87% are out there every single day, which is pretty amazing. Claire, can you talk us through this? And I believe that you have a graph from the Donkey Sanctuary that really helpfully illustrates why poo picking is so important. I know we've touched on it, but if we could go into it in a bit more detail, because I think it's going to help people really understand why this is so vital.
Yeah, it's just a way of breaking the life cycle of those worms without relying on our chemicals. So we know that after sort of 6-7 days in the dung, the eggs are going to start to hatch, and those larvae are going to then want to escape from the dung pile, and that's when they're going to be infective for our horses on the grazing. And then, so if we can take the dung off before that happens, so at least twice a week, that's going to have such a good impact on breaking the life cycle without us having to go in and give a chemical. So yeah, you guys are doing absolutely amazing. You'll have to tell us in the comments about how you keep your motivation up. I'm sure Miri can recommend a very good podcast while you're busy for that. But and we've had some comments of how difficult it is in winter, and we're absolutely with you on that one. Anyone who's ever tried to push a full wheelbarrow of dung on heavy clay and just about killed themselves going through a bog, we hear you. So it's just really about doing what you can and keeping up doing your testing, because it's the testing that's really going to help you to understand and make sure that there's none of these things going to jump out and scare you and become a problem. So doing our testing, just doing what we can in terms of our poo picking. And Miri, you've talked about the difficulty with massive fields as well, of actually getting out there and getting to it. So yeah, we hear you. There's also things you can do for ecotoxicity of wormers. So once you have worms, removing the dung and composting it thermophilically to help break down those metabolites that are in those wormers, and ways that we can also encourage our dung beetle population. So there's some information on our website, and we'll encourage you to go off and to read that. We'll put some links up as well, so you can go and look at that. But this really does make a difference. So all that hard work is absolutely worth it. And there is some statistics here about the value of that dung removal. So this is a graph that Jacqui provided, which really just shows how effective. So no removal, that top kind of peach line, you can see how the worm egg counts rise and rise, whereas with both manual and automated poo picking done, there's this parabola effect. So the worm egg counts rise, but then they come back down again. And so doing that poo picking is as effective as giving the worm at helping to control those within the horses. So yeah, keep at it, guys.
That's really good to hear. So we've put our plan in place, we're doing our testing, and we've definitely got some questions about that we can come to that are around sort of resistance, like people talking about liveries and that kind of thing. So we will come to your questions at the end, guys, so keep them coming. Please don't stop. You're not being ignored. We're just going to come to them at the end when we've kind of covered the kind of topics that we wanted to talk about today. We've put our plan in place, we're doing our testing and our management. Then what? We asked people about their decision-making process, and were you guys surprised by the results?
A little bit surprised. I mean, you guys are Westgate customers, so we know that more of you are going to come to SQPs and ask advice from our team here. We've got 6 qualified advisors that you can speak to, but then also some of you mentioned bringing your vet in, particularly where you've got horses which are compromised or other things going on. And absolutely, the SQP is a well horse service, so we'd encourage you to do that. Some of you making your own decisions, and hopefully those are also informed decisions, because wormers are prescription medicines, which is why if you've ever gone to buy one, you should be getting challenged in terms of which chemical, the horse, the backstory, because it's not just the test results that are important, it's actually the advice and the chemicals that you choose when you need them, that are going to back up by the results of what you're testing for, the time of year, and those questions as well. So yeah, it's really about getting the best advice to move that forward and to get a plan, so knowing where to go for advice. And we'd be really, really happy to support you if there's any questions on that one going forward.
So I've had a prompt from Jacqui asking me to mention large redworm, and I'm going to be honest, it's not in our notes. So if you could divulge, Jacqui, into what you'd like to talk about, I'd really appreciate it.
It was in the final thing. You can see people we have been working to a thing, but we've gone right off the script, as everybody would expect, because it's me.
So much to say, isn't there?
So I think it's always really important when you're designing control programs, and people like myself who are involved in the evidence basis and promoting these programs, is always to think of the next step and think of the future and think of the negative sequels of what we advise now. So if you think back in the 70s and 80s, we were saying everybody treat every 8 weeks or every 12 weeks, depending on the wormer that was available, whether it was ivermectin or moxidectin, treat, and we'll eradicate the worms. Well, the negative sequel of that was resistance. And that has led us into a bad place because, excuse me, despite throwing lots and lots of money to try and develop new wormers in the 90s, none of the big animal health companies were able to come up with a new wormer. And I have to say, as much as we love our horses, they're not at the top of the list because they're seen as a minor species in pharma. And so companies will not go to billions of dollars of effort to design a new horse wormer. So that's not going to happen in the foreseeable. So we're at that situation where we gave advice in the 70s and 80s, and we're getting hit by the negative sequel of it now, which is the threat of resistance and the fact that, you know, for small red worms, benzimidazole don't really work, Parentel doesn't really work most of the time, and macrocyclic lactones, the situation's getting worse. So we're doing this now. We're saying to people, just take the speed off this resistance selection and take a more evidence-based approach. Don't treat the horses that don't need wormed, especially if they've got small numbers of worms, because actually, who knows, they might be beneficial to the horse. Just focus on the guys with the big worm burdens or the big egg shedding patterns. But what we've got to think of is, what is the negative sequel of that if we give that advice, if we had a crystal ball? And one thing that we are very aware of is there used to be another worm that was really important in horses before the advent of ivermectin, which had a very strong effect on that worm, and that's called Strongylus vulgaris. What a brilliant name for a parasite. It's the large red worm. And the problem with large red worm is it can migrate once it's like eaten off paddock, like small red worms by the horse, and then it migrates into the arteries that supply the gut. And if it blocks those arteries, it can cause a very serious surgical colic, and it can be fatal. So what we want to do is we want to avoid large red worm coming back. And one of the sequels, the negative sequels of us reducing our uses of particularly drugs like ivermectin and moxidectin, is the re-emergence of large red worm. So we have to say to people, it's great, join our band just now, and this is what we want you to do, but we have to think about what else we can do just to monitor for that large red worm. And one of the things that you can do, particularly in big populations of horses that are open herds with horses coming and going, where you've really reduced your mectin use, is actually you can screen for large red worm. And you can do that by sending fecal samples to Westgate. And what they can do is they can't do an egg count to tell you what large red worm is there, because the large red worm look like the small red worm eggs. The eggs aren't a different size, but what they can do is they pop the larvae by culturing out of the eggs, and then they take them through to the third stage, and then they can differentiate large red worm from small red worm. So that's just a shout out to Westgate, because they did a lot of work behind developing the platform in order to offer you this test.
Thanks, Jacqui. Yeah, that was the culturing was something that we've been really pursuing because of this need that's opened up with this targeted use of wormers. So we have started to see, just in very small numbers of the population, the actual large red worm resurgence, which is something that's a real worry. But by screening the high risk horses, so that's really studs, horses that come from abroad, horses that have had high parasite burdens generally, that would be something to pop into as an annual screening that we'd recommend. And as well as the egg count reduction testing, just to monitor the chemicals and whether you've got any resistance to them if you're going to use them. So that's worm egg counting 10 to 14 days after a treatment, doing that again just to make sure it's been effective. Or if it's tapeworm that you're targeting, doing it 3 months after the treatment, and that will just ensure that the chemicals you've used have been effective. And we really need to start doing that and having an understanding of how those chemicals are working on our pastures too. So yeah.
This is something that definitely I have come across, and I had my young horse Dee Dee, who we may be able to prop a picture up of at some point potentially if Claire can manage. She came to me from a thoroughbred situation, and there she is, the one at the top stretching her leg, or the one at the bottom stretching her neck, and there she is with her mum in the top right hand corner. She came to me as a foal, 5 days old, and just I followed the same worming protocol that I was told to follow as a foal, and she definitely developed some resistance, or she had some resistant immune situation that was going on. And it's so interesting that you're talking about the retesting, because that has been absolutely so important, and we have now broken the cycle for her, and we're at a place where now she is more consistently fitting with the rest of the kind of the group. We're not always seeing that she has this kind of medium count. So that retesting, guys, I know, and I think this is the thing, as someone who is fully like, I am sold on the testing, I completely believe this is the way we're doing things. And I know that there have been some comments in the chat saying, you know, people are saying that, oh, it's just cheaper to buy the wormer. It can't be something that we are looking at in terms of like costs in this respect, in this way, because we can't balance the two. You can't put just the cost of the wormer as the thing that is the kind of the driving force behind what we're doing. We've got to look at what is best practice for our horses and the land that they live on. So if you do, and maybe I'm just answering out of turn, no one asked me, but here I am going for it, that it is that kind of, we've got to look at it as, regardless of the cost of it, to a degree, we've got to look at what's the best practice for the horse and go with that, even if it might be slightly cheaper just to buy the wormer. But actually long term, we're going to be doing the right thing and saving ourselves a lot of money if we can get this really in a good place. Have I said something correct there? Do you think that's an accurate opinion to give, guys?
Absolutely. I think the cost of, I mean, it's like, I mean, the thing about the wormer cost thing, and people, I mean, they should be getting asked questions by the prescriber when they go online anyway. And part of that should be, you know, is there been a test result? What's the step that's causing, you know, that's needing a prescription here? And that hopefully will tighten up as time goes on. And we've been doing a lot of work in the background to try and tighten that up. But, you know, it's like, for example, if you wanted to go and buy some perfume that was £20, and then you just went and bought it without thinking it, and you sprayed it and it didn't smell of anything, that's what it's a bit like buying a wormer, because you can buy a wormer that might not have any effect, because you're not actually, first of all, you're maybe not thinking about what worms to target. So you could be buying a small red wormer when you've got a tapeworm issue in your horse, or you might be buying a wormer that just there's resistance to. So you need to all become worm detectives as horse owners and not just take that bland approach to just buy wormers. We actually published a study about 10 years ago where actually a fecal egg count, I think we did maybe 3 or 4 a year, was cheaper than 4 treatments with well, it was moxidectin and Pramox in those days. So we actually showed that and where there was decent management, it actually cost you less actually to do an egg count, depends on how much your egg counts are, I suppose, and than just worm everything. So yes, absolutely. Yeah. Please stop just buying wormer because it's cheap. Because it's, you know, you wouldn't go in and buy your Numna with your blindfold on, would you, and just take it back home? And that probably costs a lot more than a fecal egg count test.
Absolutely. So the best part is we have a solution for you all.
Yeah.
You don't have to guess, and there is a way forward here. So Westgate have an amazing service. You can call them up, you can send them an email, you can send them a message, a direct message through their social media, and they will be able to guide you. They have trained SQPs who are going to be able to guide you. So for all of the people in the comments, we can't give out the advice that you are looking for right now, asking for what wormer should I use in this situation, what wormer should I use in that situation. Please just take a moment, head over to the Westgate website, www.westgatelabs.co.uk, find their email, drop them an email, make a phone call when you have the time, send them a message through Facebook privately, directly, and they will be able to guide you and support you. But we can't give out that advice at this very moment because we need to understand the risks that your horses are under, whether they actually need that wormer. So I just needed to say that in this moment. I'm also going to take a moment quickly just to mention the giveaway that we are running this evening. So please don't leave. We're going to open up our Q&A shortly, and I'm going to read out some of the questions that we've already got. But we have a very cool giveaway this evening. So the first prize is a 4-count plus pack from Westgate Labs, which is worth over £200. And then we're going to have two runners-up, two runners-up with a worm egg count and Excel test kit for one horse. We're going to throw in some goodies as well, so please do stick around. We will be announcing the winners this evening. So to be in with a chance, if you just want to type worms into the comments, then we will enter you into the prize draw. If you also said hello earlier, I believe we will count your name there too. So I'm going to head to some questions now that we've been receiving, and this is a really good one that I think I'm very interested to hear your answers on, and maybe Jacqui would be a good person to direct this question to. This may be controversial. I don't think it is, because I've definitely felt this, but how do we get vets to understand all the things you are covering? So many give wrong info into the clients, which makes our job so difficult as people listen to their vet over us. It's a real headache. Any advice on that? Because I am in that same position. I would love to be able to give my vet some resources or be able to open up that conversation. Jacqui, have you got any advice for this person?
Well, I think if this is a horse owner that's here and they feel that, their vet's giving them the wrong advice or the wrong advice to the yard, they need to have fun.
I think it's a yard manager. The vet is giving advice to an individual on their yard that then doesn't fit with their protocol.
I think it's good to have an open conversation with both, obviously, that owner and the vet, ideally, and there's a really good resource that there's really no excuse for this now, and point them in the direction of canter. Because these guidelines have been written by experts in the field. And they went through several rounds of assessment and before they were finalised, and was launched last year. And there's a very clear, actually, she set up the whole website. It's fantastic, and it's very accessible. Bite-sized chapters that people can go through. Some of them are a bit longer than others, but each chapter title will give an idea of the content, and it'd be a good place to point the vet and the owner in the direction of the canter guidelines, because it starts with the risk assessment and all the things that we've talked to now. All the things that are part of the risk assessment are all the evidence under that, the advice that we give in the best practice is all in the canter guidelines. What Claire and I and other canter people are going to get our heads down together over the next 12 months is actually to put horse owner facing guidelines together that are a bit shorter, a bit more lay terms and understandable. And again, they'll be made available. So again, if people there's really no excuse to follow best practice worm control on horses, because the resources are now there online to be read. So I would point them in that direction. Westgate's a great resource. We've also got great resources on our website. Equisal's got a whole knowledge hub where you can read lay articles, magazine articles written by me. You can click on YouTube talks and things that I've done about specific aspects, about diagnostics or tapeworm. You can sit, if you're not listening to Miri's podcast, or you're having trouble sleeping, you can listen to me talking about worms. So yeah, there's lots of things out there where you can get this information now.
Thanks so much, Jacqui. I really appreciate that. So we have got a lot of questions coming in. Okay, here's an interesting one. I hope this is an okay question to ask. It's interesting to me. Why does my horse show a 0 on worm counts for years, but moderately high for insisted redworm blood test?
Okay. So it depends on that horse's background, but what you might find is that horse has accumulated a burden, and you must remember that eggs only reflect the number of, not even the number of female worms doesn't even correlate with eggs. So the number of eggs that are going out of horses in its poo are basically the number of a representation of the egg shedding by female worms, and the other things that aren't accounted for by egg counts are all these insisted stages that go in. So the L3 go in to the mucosa, the gut wall of the intestine, and they undergo 3 larval stages, and then they come back out. And of course, then there's male worms and female worms. So what you might find in this horse is maybe even controlling its burden to an extent where it's stopping the parasite in its tracks in the intestinal wall. But actually, the worms aren't getting through to the females to mate and produce eggs. So that probably explains, I mean, a moderate to high small red worm score, I don't really know what that means. Does that mean between a threshold of 5,000 and 10,000 worms? If it does, that's really quite a small burden of small red worms. So it's not like you would have millions of worms, which you get in some cases where the horse would have quite a high egg count and also a very high serum score. So that's why you can see that. And that's why we designed the test, because we wanted people to be able to understand the burden within the horse when the egg count's low. So we did an abattoir survey way back when I worked at Liverpool, and we had one horse that had, I think it was 100 eggs per gram in its poo. And we counted something like, I think it was 6.3 million larvae we estimated in its gut wall. So you can see there's an imbalance there between egg counts and larval stages, and that's why it's important to be able to use both tests to inform treatments at the right times of year.
That's brilliant. We've got some great questions coming in. I know you're a passionate poo picker, Claire, so please, could you explain to us a bit about like your dung heap? Like, is it good practice to put a dung heap in the corner of a field, for example?
Yeah, definitely not, unfortunately. It just mitigates all your hard work that you've done, because we know these larvae are motile, and my computer is about to kick me out, I think. It's counting me down, so I'm hoping that I don't...
Oh my goodness. The webinar may end suddenly, everyone. We do apologise in advance if that does happen. If it does, this has been recorded. Oh dear, Claire has been evacuated from the webinar. I can explain this though, I think. So when you gather your poo in one place in the field, the life cycle of the eggs takes place, and then the worms just will migrate back out into the grazing, essentially. You've got to take the poo fully away from the field to make sure that you are breaking that life cycle. Did I get it right, Jacqui?
Absolutely. So yeah, so we did that. We had someone cut grass outside Glasgow Vet School and measured these larvae that were coming out of poos, and they can, I mean, probably your third stage larvae, your small redworm or large redworm, they can probably, they can probably migrate about 6 feet, 12 feet or so. The other thing that's really important, 2 things are important. First of all, arabiatid mites. The tapeworm is quite different. It's a hermaphrodite worm. It looks like kind of conchiglia pasta, and it releases these segments at the end which contain eggs, which go in the poo, and then these eggs then are in the poo, and there's these little mites, and there can be thousands of them everywhere on paddocks, and these little arabiatid mites come into the poo, they eat the egg, and then the egg develops through the larval stage within the mite. So that's called an indirect life cycle. And then that mite wanders around the paddock, and no one's ever done it. We haven't ever put like a mite cam on because they're very small, obviously. We need a small camera, but the mites can probably migrate quite far, and then they can recontaminate pasture. And then the horse is infected when it's eating grass with an infected mite. And then once the mite is eaten, it's digested, and the tapeworm pops out, and its little head, the Scolex, latches onto the intestinal wall where it can cause damage. So it's really important, if you're removing dung, is like get away from those paddocks. I would say ideally 30 feet away. It's also really important that you don't put it near a watercourse, because things can come out of dung piles that then contaminate the watercourses, and that's not a good thing. So please don't put dung piles in fields, and don't put them near watercourses.
Very good. So there's a question here that I think is a really good one for you to answer, Jacqui, why Claire fights for her life to get back into the webinar. So we touched on it earlier, and I think this is a really interesting topic and one that people are going to find probably very valuable. But why do things like EMS and other health issues impact the horse's risk, and why, if you had a horse, so for example, I have a horse with PSSM, which is a metabolic issue, well, it's a myopathy, so it's something to do with her muscles, but it definitely means that she is more affected by things in her environment. And she actually came to me with a weird worm that Claire would remember. I think it was an ascarid. It was a different and something that she should have got rid of when she was little. She still had, and she quite often has a tapeworm result. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about those kind of horses with maybe a bit of a immune compromised body because of those health issues.
Absolutely. I mean, in any individual, whether it's us or a horse, you've only got enough proteins and resource to send to different things. So in some cases, if you've got a disease where the resources are being used up with whatever that disease is, whether it's a cancer or whatever, welcome back, then it can't put as much resource into the immune system because it's been distracted elsewhere. So sometimes that sort of bystander thing can affect the immune response to a worm, for example. Particularly in the case of something like EMS, what we find is a dysregulation of some sort of like types of hormones are in the blood, and they are known to suppress immune responses anyway. So that's why, for example, maybe in horses with PPID, for example, we see this sort of depressed immune response, and it's thought that these horses do become more susceptible to worms. And there are some research studies that provide tenuous evidence of that, where they get higher egg counts in horses with PPID, similarly with aged horses as well. And that might be a resource allocation thing as well. And the thing that you saw with your horse with ascarids is I've had quite a few people ask about that, because usually foals have these are these big spaghetti worms that live in the small intestine, and these ascarids are really common in foals, particularly between 6 and 9 months. And unlike small red worm, for example, all animals tend to get a very good immune response to ascarids, and probably because the parasite migrates through the lungs as part of its life cycle, and they have this really good immune response, and they tend to not develop ascarid infections. But in horses, as they get older, if they have something that affects or compromises their immunity, they can pick up and develop ascarid infections. That's not uncommon.
So interesting. I think we may have come to the end of having lots of questions. If there's anybody that has got a particular question, then please do send it in. Well, there's one more question that is interesting, but can the I don't know the answer to this at all, but can the tapeworm cycles survive the hay process? I.e., can they spread through hay made in the next door field to the horse? Thank you.
Yeah, there's very little known about that, actually. I'm actually trying to write a review just now and finding some information. I suppose there is some risk there, depending on the level of contamination in the state of the hay. So there is potential, but I have to say the jury's out on whether hay is an important source of tapeworm infection. Yeah, that's what I would say. If I had a really tapeworm infected field, I probably wouldn't make hay from it and give it to horses. That's probably telling you everything. The irribated mites tend to like to go down into the soil and the sequester there, so that's a way that the hay could become contaminated. Here she is thinking on the spot. So that's a way that hay could become contaminated if the mites then come back out the soil and then get into the hay, rather than it surviving the hay making process.
Claire, we had a question asking just asking, what does the fecal worm egg count actually test for? Because I think there's a little bit of uncertainty, confusion, and it would be great just to clear that up to kind of round this conversation off.
Yeah, so it's adult small red worm that are producing millions of eggs every day, and they're very evenly distributed through the dung, and that's what we're measuring, is the egg shedding of these adult worm burdens. So what it won't tell you is a level of worm burden, and it won't tell you whether you've got any of those encysted larvae, because they are immature and they're secreted into the gut wall, they're not laying eggs. So that's what we're counting, is that egg shedding. And those are those horses that are susceptible to parasites, and they're going to be kicking those out onto the pasture. And that's the infection that we're going to be looking at, that contamination potential. So that's really why we're doing those worm egg counts, to monitor that and then to be able to act to reduce that level of infection potential on our pastures.
To round us off, before I announce our winners, which I have got, I've got it, don't leave anyone. One last question. But what health issues do worms cause? Like, can you really be really clear? Why are these conversations so important? What are we protecting our horses from? What are we trying to avoid in our horses?
Oh, they have massive impacts, and it depends on the parasite really as to the symptoms that we're going to be seeing. But I mean, right from the...
Oh,
Claire's
frozen.
Evacuated again.
Yeah, pick up.
Pick up where she left
Jacqui
off.
is not doing me well, is it? No.
Oh, she's back.
You're back.
In and out, in and out. Yeah, I mean, the top and the bottom is that horses die of parasite infection and when they get overwhelmed by them. And that's really the bottom line of what we want to prevent. But when they're young, they have, we can have respiratory damage, we can have nutritional impacts, which means that foals never reach their full potential. We've got all sorts of damages, colics, impactions. The large strong gullet that we talked about, that there is a colic, there's hemorrhages. I mean, it's broad and has massive potential impact on our horse's well-being. So these are really, really serious complications that we get from parasite burdens that are out of control.
It's really good. And there's so much information on the Westgate website, guys. If you have liveries on your yard who are uncertain about why testing is so important, please direct them. Somebody asked if there are posters that could be printed off, which might be maybe you have a resource for that.
We do have some posters on the website, yeah. So you can download them as PDF, or just for a small postage cover, you can get those in our shop as well.
Oh, that's brilliant. And that's a really good way of you guys, putting people's minds at rest, explaining often this resistance, as in not the worm resistance, but the resistance to test comes from lack of knowledge and lack of understanding of how important this is. So the Westgate website is an amazing resource for all of that information. Now, without further ado, I will announce our winner. So I'm going to announce our runners-up first. So our runners-up are Tina Whitaker. I spoke over the moment. Oh, I ruined it. I was hoping you might do it between the runners-up and the main winner.
You can do it again, Miri. It's
okay,
fine.
All right. So I'm going to do the runners-up again, okay? Because I think nobody heard. So Tina Whitaker and Vivian Spencer, you will be contacted. I hope Kat will contact you directly. If you don't get contacted, drop Westgate a message and they will send you your prize. And then the winner of our main prize this evening is Caroline McCooey. What a wonderful name.
Brilliant.
Congratulations. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this evening. It has been such an interesting conversation. The comments have been fantastic. The questions have been really, really great. Thank you so much, Claire and Jacqui, for giving your time this evening. It's been a real honour to be part of what a cool thing this has been.
Yeah, no, it's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. I think what we've really demonstrated is just how much there is to say about parasite control in horses. We could nearly do a second webinar with all the questions that we haven't got to yet, because there are some fabulous questions in there that we'd really love to answer for you. Yeah, just for now, thank you so much for watching, and hopefully this has given you just such a leg up of how to do parasite control better for your horses.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Jacqui. Do you have any closing words?
No, thanks for having me. It's been great. I particularly enjoyed playing the drums at the end there. That was the highlight.
We will see you guys for another webinar soon. Thank you so much again. Good evening.
Take care.
Good
Thanks.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.